except with like demons instead of Easter eggs. Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Sarah and I love to talk about books. And today I've got a wee bonus video for you to finish wrapping up everything that I read in the month of February. If you saw my video on Saturday, you'll have seen all the new-ish releases that I read in February. And today I'm going to talk to you about the backlist titles that I got through. So I've got 2 5 stars, 2 4 stars and a 3 star to talk about, and as ever I'm going to kick off with the 5 stars because I think they deserve the most attention, but do stick around for the lower rated titles that I'm talking about, because just because I wasn't totally in love with a book doesn't mean that you wouldn't be. Before I start, you may hear some noises in the background. I have a little person playing. He says he's not going to come on for any screen time, but you might hear the sounds of multiple airplane crashes as I'm talking. So the first book I want to talk about is over here on my bookshelf, and it is The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi. I read this for Scott and Nelle over at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot's new book club, Read Under the Bed. Was it Read Under the Bed? I think it's Read Under the Bed. So this was not on my TBR for this year, wasn't on my radar, because I've already got an Akwaeke Emezi book on my TBR trolley, Freshwater, which I haven't got to yet. But I was really keen to take part in Scott and Nelle's book club because I think they are fab, and I would probably read anything they ever recommended, so I knew I could trust them with this pick. We are due to be discussing this book at the weekend, so there will be a video up on their channel about this, so I'm not going to labour it too much, but I was astonished by this book. So unsurprisingly, this is about the death of Vivek Oji, but it is also about a lot more than that. It's about his life, his family, his friends, his search to find a way to express his identity, and it's also a book about the importance of being seen. So it opens with Vivek's mother finding his body on their veranda, and then we delve into Vivek's story to find out how that happened. And I was glued to this book from the very first chapter. I am really partial to an LGBTQ+ story anyway, and in the past few years I've really enjoyed books written and by African authors and set in Africa. So this brought both of those elements together, but there was something more than that. There's something really magical about Emezi's writing, which makes me really excited to get to Freshwater. As we got to know the characters, particularly the character of Vivek, but also his cousin Osita, I was just really invested in their stories. This is a really powerful book about the constraints placed on people when they face prejudice, whether that's against their gender identity, their sexual preference, or even just their self-identity. Vivek is a really wonderful, vibrant person, and so his death is a real tragedy, not just for the reader or for Vivek himself, but also all the people around him. And I think it's the refusal of societies or organisations to accept that vibrant spectrum of human identities that's really at the root of this story. And I think voices like Emezi's are really important in calling those sorts of things out, because it's the only way to change the status quo. So this is a real page turner of a book, but it has a really important message at its core, which for me are the ingredients for the perfect book. And then my second 5-star read was on my Kindle, and it was Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere. I read her other book, Everything I Never Told You, about 1.5 years ago, and I really enjoyed that and was looking forward to getting to this one ever since. And this book is quite different, I think, from Everything I Never Told You, but it still has that domestic drama slant that I really love. So this is the story of 2 families. We have the Richardsons, who are kind of like the perfect all-American family. They are pillars of their very ordered, very middle-class society in which they live, Quaker Heights I think it's called, and they've got 4 children, and even their 4 children fit all the stereotypes of American kids. You've got the jock, you've got Little Miss Popular, you've got the nerd, and you've got the rebel. And the Richardsons rent out one of their properties to another family, the Warrens, and this is Mia and her daughter Pearl, and they have come to Quaker Heights, or is it Shaker Heights? It might be Shaker Heights. It might be neither of them. I might be making this up. I'll put it on the screen. But they live quite a kind of a nomadic lifestyle. They follow Mia's artistic calling. She's a photographer. And they've never really settled in one place for long. But Mia has promised Pearl that this will be where they settle, so Pearl can finish school and have a bit more of a stable life. The children of both these families become friends. Pearl is happy to have that stability, to be able to make friends for the first time in her life. And as the Richardson kids welcome her into their fold, they in turn are kind of drawn to the life that Pearl and Mia have lived, and in particular Mia herself. The tension begins when Mia and Mrs. Richardson find themselves on opposing sides of a custody battle for a Chinese baby. So the mother is a Chinese immigrant, and she abandoned her baby in a fog of what sounds like postnatal depression and lack of money and lack of support. And then on the other side, we have this very wealthy white family who want to adopt the baby. Media attention around this case kind of gets whipped up into a frenzy, and Mrs. Richardson is sceptical of Mia's stance and her motivations for supporting the Chinese mother, and so she uses her journalism connections to dig into Mia's background. While she's doing all this snooping, she's too distracted to realise some of the issues her own children are facing. So much like with the death of Vivek Oji, this book opens with the ending, with the Richardson family's house burning down and their youngest daughter nowhere to be found. And then we work our way towards that point to find out how it all came to be. And whilst everything I never told you was really focused on one family and was almost like a character study, this is a much broader story. It has a much bigger cast. And I think in both cases, Ning's writing is good enough to carry the story, and it's the story in this book that really drew me into it, because the writing is flawless, but I was just so interested in how all the different strands of the story were woven and brought together. And for me, it was particularly Mia's story that I was interested in. I thought the teenager story was interesting as well, and I thought they were really well formed characters. But I'm much more interested in complex adults with a backstory, and Mia is that. I found her and her backstory really intriguing. And I think Ning, with these 2 books now that I've read of her, she's definitely one of these authors that I will be looking out to see what she writes in future. I think she's really strong, she tells really interesting stories, and I can't wait to see what she does next. And then the first of my 4-star books was The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. Yes, this is the most disgusting book that I own, and what makes it worse is I bought it in this condition, but it was super cheap on the charity table in my local supermarket. And if you've been on my channel for any length of time, you will have heard me say that I do not do fantasy. But something about this book really intrigues me. I do like folklore and fairy tales, which this book is really based on, and also it's set in the Russian winter, and for some reason that always really appeals to me as well. So I was a bit conflicted because I knew it was a fantasy story, and so when I saw a cheap battered copy of it, I thought, oh, I'll give it a go. So this is a story about a family in historic northern Rus, which is now become Russia. I think this is like set in the Middle Ages. I don't really know. My sort of historical fiction goes back to about the 1800s and no further. But yeah, particularly this focuses on the youngest daughter, Vasilisa, who her mother died when she was born, and she carries the magic of her grandmother in her. And she has grown up in the stories of her people, which honour the spirits of both the home and nature, and particularly the story of Morov, kind of like the Russian version of Jack Frost, I gather. You know, they were all huddled around the fire and her nurse would tell these stories. This is set in a time where the women's place was in the home and in a backdrop of some incredibly cruel and bitter Russian winters. And so honouring the spirits is a way to keep the home safe, to guarantee good crops and things like that. And when her father remarries a very devout, very pious woman, Vasilisa is singled out for her quite independent behaviour and her kind of occultish ways, and is told that she either has to marry or get shipped out to a convent. A convent where nuns go, where nuns live.
Where's nuns?
They're in the church. And along with this new wife, Christianity comes to the little village in the form of this like enigmatic young priest who focuses in on Vasilisa and really wants to save her soul. And as the villagers get drawn more closely into the fold of this priest, only Vasilisa can see that they're turning away from the spirits is the reason behind their failing harvests and the increasingly bitter conditions that they are having to experience in winter, where they are low on firewood, they're starving, and there are dangers lurking in the forest. And it becomes quickly apparent that whilst everyone is casting aspersions at Vasilisa and calling her a witch, she is the only one who's going to be able to protect her people from the dangers that hide in the forest. So actually, I thought this book was a lot of fun. I think the writing's really evocative. I could really feel the cold whenever they were outside, and I wanted to huddle in at the fire with them when they came back indoors. I really enjoyed some of the relationships within the family, and I thought Vasilisa is, she's a really strong, independent character who's bucking the trend for women at her time to run wild in the forest. And actually the power struggle between her and the priest kind of gave me vibes of Joanne Harris's Chocolat, except with like demons instead of Easter eggs. I liked this book's slow build towards its dramatic ending, in that it wasn't too fantasy-y. Like, there's no dragons, there's no realms or shit like that. I did zone out a bit when they were in the High Prince's castle court, and then they were talking about monasteries and stuff like that, blah blah blah. Basically anything about men. And the ending is like full-on fantasy. But by that point, the story had drawn me in enough that I just went along with it. But what I did love were the fairy tales and the spirits, and how they were intersecting with the real world, and also that challenging of societal norms and what is expected of women. This is the first in a trilogy. I doubt I'll read the others. I think I got what I needed from this book. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. And then my next 4-star read is also a book that looks a bit manky, and it is Chernobyl Strawberries by Vesna Goldsworthy. This looks manky because it's been on my shelves since about 2005, and it has a big sticker slapped on the front because it was one I picked up from the staff room when I worked in Waterstones. It was damaged, as you can see. Oh, no, you can't. It was damaged, so it couldn't be sold, so we were allowed to just pick up the books like that. I had originally picked this up because of its title, because I've always been quite intrigued by the Chernobyl disaster and what it meant for the people who were involved. Spoiler alert, not really, but if you were ever tempted to pick this book up because of that title, let me just tell you something. This book has nothing to do with Chernobyl. It's not even set in the same country. There's a brief mention of making jam with strawberries from Chernobyl, but that's before the disaster even happened. And whilst the author was inspired to write this by a diagnosis of breast cancer, the two are not related. So confusion and disappointment and a little bit of feeling cheated by this book aside, I actually did quite enjoy it. So this is a this is a memoir of a woman who is a poet from Belgrade, and she moved to England in the 80s to start a life with her English husband. And it's a non-linear collection of family history, autobiography, and musings on what it was like to grow up under communism. She explores what it means to come from a country that no longer exists because it was Yugoslavia when she was growing up, and then also how it felt to watch her home be destroyed and redistributed into different countries whilst living in a new country which had a role in that destruction. And what I felt was at the core of her story is the mix of cultures and backgrounds that created who she was, where she grew up, and what it means to live in a new place and struggle with both feelings of belongingness, but then also feeling not of that place either. And although the context in what her story is told, so, you know, the Balkan Wars, but also the enormity that is living and being treated for breast cancer when you have a young child, this is actually a very personal, I was going to say narrow, but that sounds negative. It's a very laser focused telling of her story. This is almost stream of consciousness, so it's not linear at all, but within that, the stream of consciousness, she can jump from a different place, a different memory, sometimes even within the same paragraph. And I'm not always a fan of such fuzzy writing, but I think it really worked in this. I was worried because she is a poet and I'm just too stupid for poetry. I feel like it doesn't click with me a lot of the time. So I was worried that her writing wouldn't. And the lyrical quality of this stream of consciousness is actually really easy to read, and I think it really worked for a memoir. So although, while I do feel cheated by the title, and it has taken me, what, like 16 years to finally pick this off my bookcase, I cannot believe that's even a thing. But I am glad that I finally got to this. And then my final book that I read in February, I gave 3 stars to, and it is also a memoir, and it is Split, a memoir of divorce by Suzanne Finnamore. So this is one of a few divorce memoirs that I bought last year to help me through my own experience, and is very different to the other one that I've read so far, which was How to Fall Apart by Arden, which I loved, but that one is very much self-help focused and is about a divorce that happened pretty mutually, whereas this is very focused on Suzanne's own experiences and feelings, and it's a divorce due to infidelity, which is very much more like my experience. And I think infidelity gives divorce a whole different kind of, I was going to say flavour, let's say taint. And you deal with very different things when you are struggling not only with the fact that your marriage is ending, but also it's ending for a reason that you are totally blindsided by, a reason that makes the person that you were married to a complete stranger to you. You're betrayed and your world totally falls apart, and you had pretty much no say in the matter. And that was very much the case for Suzanne. One night she is so 1950s sounding, but she's fixing her husband his usual after work drink, and he tells her that he wants a divorce. And it's only slowly that she discovers what the real truth is behind why he wants to leave. This book is structured around the stages of grief, and I found that to be so appropriate. I think divorce, because it's so prevalent in our society, that if you've never been through it, or if you've had a more positive experience of it, people don't tend to take it as seriously as it is, but particularly for those of us who were not expecting our lives to change so dramatically so quickly, it really can feel like a loss on the same level as a death. So this book opens at the exact moment that her husband asks for the divorce and follows the slow drip of truths and how she coped with that. And it's really honest. So she's open about red flags in the relationship that she had maybe either not noticed or had noticed but tried to accept or sweep away. How she used alcohol to cope during the initial discovery phase, how difficult it was for her to function at that stage. And, you know, she's even honest about some of the desperate things that abandoned partners will do in order to prove their worthiness to the other person, to try and change their mind, to try and save the thing that they have built their entire lives around. Throughout this, she has some really interesting and quirky characters who help support her, give her shoulders to cry on, and also give her tough love when it's needed. She has a snarkiness and dark sense of humour that I really appreciated, and I loved her pettiness because she's keeping it real, which is so essential when there seems to be like this myth of the dignified divorcee, which I think is a really destructive myth, and it really serves no one apart from partners who want to hurt other people with impunity. What I did feel was lacking was a context for the marriage. So we learn little to nothing about her ex-husband, and without that it's hard to really relate to how devastated and broken she is. But I think this was written quite soon, if not in the aftermath of the divorce, and I totally get how it's difficult, if not impossible, to want to look back on any of the good times, especially when they've been cancelled out by truths and behaviours that are exposed by the divorce process. And I guess what we miss in the reminiscing, we gain in just how honest and raw she is in the telling of her divorce experience. I read this at the start of the month, and now I'm thinking, why did I only give it 3 stars? And I think there was just a bit of a, it was a personal 3 stars, I think, for me, just that I felt there was a bit of distance between myself and Suzanne. Maybe this should be a 4 star. I was going to call out some privilege, but actually she does really struggle after, because it was a privilege only really afforded by the marriage, and then once the marriage fell apart, she did have money struggles and things like that. Yeah, tough one to rate for me, actually. But I am glad that I read it. I think I found it really hard to find books about divorce that aren't, you know, like romance ones about someone finding someone else or whatever. And it is something that so many of us will experience. So I think there should be more voices like this out there. So that's me on my soapbox about that one. So those are the other books that I read in February. If you didn't see it and you want to know the new releases that I read in February, check back to my last video because that talks about all of them. It was a really good bunch. I definitely think there's something in that selection for anyone. Whereas I know this is a little bit more of a jumbled, perhaps niche assortment, but I would definitely both shout out the book and Scott and Nelle's book club for bringing this book into my life, because I thought this was fabulous. By far and away the best book I read in February. So I will link to their channel below. So I said I would get this video up today. It's now the evening, I still have to edit, and so I'm going to wrap this up really quickly and crack on with that as soon as I can, and hopefully get up before midnight. But until my next video on Saturday, bye.
There's a practice.
No, I just edit these bits out.